The secret sauce behind the Hollywood color grades that we love and aspire to as filmmakers has been hiding right in front of us all along. To show you what it is, I want to take a look at your answers to a question that I recently posted here on the channel. What are your favorite color grades of the last 10 years? Let's take a look at the top 15 answers to that question. Now, if we look at this list, The Batman, Saltburn, The Holdovers, Poor Things, Sicario, Moonlight, La La Land, Dunkirk, there's a ton of variety here, right? Like variety in terms of genre, variety in terms of look. Each of these movies has a very distinctive look, variety in terms of cinematographer, colorist, post house. But if we look a little more closely, there's some interesting trends that start to emerge. The first one is that for all these movies, even though they all had the opportunity to capture in high quality digital format, over half of them chose to shoot on film. Well, that's kind of interesting, right? The next trend is even more interesting. All but one of these movies was either shot on film or it explicitly used film emulation in its color grade. Or in the case of movies like Dune and The Batman, they actually used a film intermediate in post-production. And these insights really lead me right to the punchline for today's video. What is the secret sauce behind these amazing Hollywood color grades? It's film. It's always been film. In the next few minutes, I want to back that claim up, and then I'm going to show you how our favorite filmmakers use this secret sauce to achieve incredible grades, and why it may not always work out the same way for the rest of us. Okay, so we've heard from you guys on some of your favorite grades of the last 10 years. We've looked at the role that film played in those color grades, but now let's look at some of the top practitioners in the game and see what we can learn from what they have to say and what they have to show about the role of film in their processes. First person I want to talk about, one of my favorite colorists working in the game right now, Ivan Lucas at Company 3. Ivan has been around color grading for as long as color grading has been around, and he's graded so many movies that I absolutely love, including movies like Barbie, Killers of the Flower Moon, The Irishman, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, so many iconic grades. And if you go and look up pretty much any interview you can find with Ivan, you're going to hear him talking about his affection for the filmic rendering of an image that goes all the way back to his days as a color timer when he was still working with film before digital color grading was even a thing. So he's a great first example of the central role that film plays in whatever grade, whatever look he's creating, whether it's Barbie or Killers of the Flower Moon. Like, I love that those came out in the same year, and I love that it was the same colorist on them, given how different they look. They both look amazing, they both look beautiful, and they could not look more different from one another. Next up, Tom Poole, also at Company 3, also one of my favorite colorists. There was a great conversation that got started a couple of years ago on a colorist forum where someone was asking, how do I get the quote-unquote Company 3 look? If you don't know, Company 3 is one of the largest color grading companies in the world. They employ some of the top color grading talent in the world. And this thread became a very, very verbose discussion about like how to get that signature look that people see coming out of Company 3. And much to everybody's surprise, Tom Poole himself dropped into the thread and shared how he achieves that look that he has helped to create and to innovate. It's a simple 4-step recipe, and step 1 of that recipe, use a decent print emulation LUT. In other words, use film emulation. Next up, Steve Yedlin, ASC. Steve is in a category of his own in terms of his knowledge of imaging pipelines and film rendering pipelines, and he comes at this from a very different perspective because he's a cinematographer out there shooting big movies like Knives Out and Star Wars: The Last Jedi and Glass Onion, and he has taken it upon himself. He sees the filmic rendering of his image as so central to achieving the image that he's after that he's taken it upon himself to own and to create the entire rendering pipeline for every movie that he's shot digitally over the course of his career. So he's an amazing example of someone who really understands the power of film and who embraces that filmic rendering of image and is very explicit about controlling the image in that way for every single project that he takes on. Last but not least, Roger Deakins, ASC, BSc. I've saved Roger Deakins for last on purpose because Roger Deakins is the opposite of a film apologist. He's very agnostic in terms of the film versus digital discussion. You can find interviews where he talks about not really caring if something is shot on film or shot on digital. He just cares about getting the strongest possible image. And yet Roger Deakins, if you look back at his transition from shooting on film to shooting on digital, now 15, 16 years ago, you can see when he first had a LUT commission that would emulate the film negative and film print that he was used to shooting onto and viewing with. He had a LUT commission that would characterize his digital images to look that same way. And now 15, 16 years later, he is still shooting and grading under that LUT and simply modifying it and tuning it and tweaking it for every movie that he shoots, whether that's Sicario, Blade Runner 2049, 1917. It's all under that same film emulation. So even Roger Deakins, who is quite agnostic in his own words to the film versus digital thing, has literally never shot a movie digitally that did not go through a film emulation. Okay, so what does this all mean? Film is the secret sauce. Great. What can we take away from this? How can we apply this knowledge to our benefit when it comes to our color grading? Well, it gives us two really simple things that we can take away depending on where you're practicing and what your focus is in the filmmaking world. On the color grading side, it's simple. This means we better be working within a modeled film system. We better be doing something that gives us film behavior if we want to get grades that look like these grades that we admire, right? If we don't do that, then we're going to have a really tough time achieving the same thing because all these grades that we love are doing that, right? Number two, if you're a cinematographer, this means you need to be shooting through a film-like LUT in order to get the lighting and the ratio laid down that's going to work into that pipeline in a positive way without you needing to compensate for or adjust for the difference between what you shot through and what you're now trying to render your image through, okay? Now, at this point, you might be thinking, all right, Cullen, like that all makes sense. I hear what you're saying, but I've tried this before. I've tried looks and power grades and LUTs and plugins that all say that they are film emulations, and I've never once dropped one onto my image and had my grades suddenly start looking like the movies that we're talking about. So what gives? Well, I'm going to show you how I got this in a moment, but I want to show you something special here. Let's go into Resolve, and I'm going to show you a plugin that uses the color science that's used by these movies and by these filmmakers. And I don't mean similar color science, I mean the exact same color science. So let's take a look at our image nice and big here in Resolve and look at what happens when I apply this Hollywood film plugin onto this log state image. Okay, lots of interesting stuff happening here, lots to unpack. Let me tell you what I see when I look at this plugin applied to this image. Let's start by talking about contrast and tonality. So if we look at the contrast in the middle of the image, meaning around middle exposure, we've got this really strong linear type of contrast that's really increasing the contrast ratio. It's making the image eye-grabbing, it's making it feel bold, it's making it feel snappy. But what's interesting is as we move away from middle exposure and the areas immediately above and below that point and get down into the toe, down into the shadows and up into the shoulder and into the highlights, something interesting is happening. Our contrast is actually reducing and compressing, and we're getting some softness in that area. So even in this image, which has a lot of dynamic range, like we've got full-on bright practical sources frame left here, and then we've got areas like this one down here in the lower right, which is basically nothing, right? Because there's really not much exposure to the camera that even happened here. But it's all being handled really well because as we move off of that middle and up into the top, for example, we're gently rolling things over and we're never like smashing into the edge of what my display can do. Even if you look at the histogram here, we're gently tapering off. Nothing is crashing through this 100% wall here and leaving me with the feeling of like a burned in hole in my monitor, right? Similarly, down in the low end, I think even more impactfully down in the low end, there's something magic happening here. If we look at these areas that are way deep down there, that are effectively zero exposure, there's something magical happening here. Like I'm zooming in on it just to kind of call out the area. But even if I just sit back and look at the image and look at those dark areas, what it feels like when I'm looking through this kind of rendering is like, ooh, if I just lean forward a little bit and I just squint a little bit, there actually could be a little something in there, like lurking in that darkest area of the image. That's magical. And by the way, just as a side note, anytime you can achieve that in a color grade, I don't care what you're using, what you're grading, how you're working, anytime you can achieve that in a color grade, you got something good cooking, keep going that direction, okay? But what's cool here is this is just happening off the shelf as a result of this plugin being applied with no grading happening underneath. It's giving me that just as my starting point. Similar thing with these highlights, they're just being rolled over and handled in that really nice way. All right, so that's some contrast and tonality aspect of it. Let's take a look at the colors here. So I'm just gonna ask you a question. Like when I started on this log state image, anyone who's done any grading of images that have bright neons like this before probably had the same reaction of like, well, that's gonna be a problem. That's gonna look weird. That's gonna break. That's gonna clip. That's gonna artifact when we try to get that image onto the screen, because anyone who's created these images before has seen it happen over and over again, right? Almost regardless of like the LUT or the color management or the solution that you're using. I think we've all just kind of gotten accustomed to like, oh yeah, that stuff just breaks and then we got to solve for it underneath, right? But it's not the case here. This is not only not breaking, it's being rendered in a really beautiful way. Like it still feels like there's plenty of color and life and variation and gradation in this part of the image, but it's both things at once. We're getting that variation and that gradation and that nice rich color that again is just happening automatically without me having to spend grading cycles on solving for problems like that. That like a lot of us, I'm almost just like used to that. Like, yeah, that's just part of the process is we got to deal with edge saturations because most output transforms aren't going to be able to do so on an automatic basis. And that really leads to a key insight that I've learned over the last couple of years of my career of like really studying these top colorists and filmmakers. Their starting point is more like our end point, if that makes sense. So like in an image like this, through most imaging pipelines, I'm going to spend a good chunk of my grade on this stuff because I can't even really begin looking for opportunities until I've solved problems like really poor rendering of hypersaturated things. So that would become, if not my endpoint, a point well into my grading process. Whereas these top colorists, they get to skip that part. They're like bowling with bumpers. They just get that right out of the box with a film rendering like the one that we're seeing here, okay? And to get a better sense of what I mean when I start talking about that starting point and the impact that it can have and how far forward or how far set back we can end up being, depending on how we set ourselves up, let's take a look at some other popular film emulation plugins that I've asked to do the exact same thing that I asked this plugin to do. Here's what we got with our Hollywood film plugin. That's what we've been looking at. Let's now look at what I'm just going to call plugin A, okay? I've asked it for this exact same thing. Let's see what kind of differences emerge. Wow, that's different, right? That's a fundamentally different rendering of image. And if we look just at these neons that we were just talking about here, that discrimination, that gradation, that variation that we were seeing so well preserved a moment ago with our Hollywood film plugin, it's gone here. It's just completely newt. And this is a good example of like the type of transform that we're often working under, that we often have to solve for underneath. And then we can start color grading. Then we can start doing what these big colorists are spending their entire grading process on, which is like, how can I elevate this? How can I make this look even more like my collaborators want to see it look in its final form, okay? But let's look at a couple of other differences that we see here with plugin A since we're on it. So let's go back and again, kind of ground ourselves in the contrast and the tonality aspect of things. So in terms of the middle of the image, we actually have, I would say, a similar level of contrast happening through the middle of the image if we go back to our Hollywood film rendering. Through the middle, it's about the same, but that really nice behavior that I called out a moment ago of the way shadows are being shaped and the way that depth is felt in that area, that's not a thing anymore. Like it no longer feels like there's stuff happening down here in this area, for example. We had it here and now it's gone. Now it just feels like a more traditional, yeah, that's a black thing. And maybe if we had like the kind of time I feel like I never end up having in a color grade, maybe I can throw up a power window and kind of open up that area a little bit, but often not the case. And this is again, something that we have to labor for as opposed to getting right out the gate with the Hollywood film plugin that we're looking here. And I want to emphasize as well, as we start comparing to other plugins, I'm not just talking about a difference in color grade, okay? So I don't mean the difference between like, oh, well, here's the way one person graded it. Maybe we like some of the things better that they did here. And maybe there are some things that this other colorist did that we don't like as much, but it's just two different color grades and there's just differences that we can observe that we may like more or less between the two, right? It's not that simple. These are fundamental differences in the behavior of two very different systems. We're going to talk more about that as we work through these next few images, but I want to call that out early on. These are not just surface level differences. These are differences that are the natural outcome of fundamentally different engines that are driving these two final renderings of image, okay? So if we once again go back to plugin A, we talked about our colors and really what this feels like in general to me, especially if I look at the vector scope. This feels to me like we are trying to get a filmic rendering of image using video color correction type tools. Like this feels like video saturation to me, which is why it feels so extreme and garish, especially as we get to the outer edges. I also want to point out, when we make this cut from our Hollywood plugin to this one, it almost feels like there's new things happening, doesn't it? Like it feels like there's stuff being added. And I just want to emphasize, that's not because there were things missing before. That's because there are things that are being imposed that are not innate of the image. They're being imposed by this plugin that is being applied to the image. And it's the biggest one, like the easiest example I would call out is this almost like kind of like blue atmosphere or blue wash that I feel happening here. That's just something this thing is doing. It is not innate of the original scene. Okay, so there's new things happening, but they're not innate of the scene. They're innate of the transformation, and they're moving us further away from the original intent of the image. Okay, let's keep exploring here. I want to go over here to shot number 2. Let's go back to our Hollywood plugin for a moment. And again, just observe the strength of the simple contrast and tonality, or what feels like simple contrast and tonality. It's actually quite complex, but the strength of what's happening here. We've got that nice strong contrast through the middle, nicely shaped as we approach hot highlights like on this character's hair, and then going all the way down to our shadows, which even at their deepest point, even like this dark area of her sweater down in the lower frame right, still kind of feels like there might be a little something left in there that I could see if I just looked at it with the right eyes, right? Let's compare to plugin A. So plugin A, we already called out a moment ago. It has some difference in saturation. Like there's more saturation and it's a different kind of saturation than we're seeing with our Hollywood plugin, right? But that's even too reductive of a way to put it, because if we look at the actual results of that difference, let's zoom in on our character's face here for a minute. So I'm just going to call out this observation. If I was looking at this rendering of this image for the first time, if I'm like the director or something like that, I would want to have a conversation with my makeup person. Like, what did you do? Like, what is this like off-color, very thick pancake makeup that you've applied to my talent? But that's not the makeup person. That is the rendering. Look at our Hollywood film. Look at our plugin. So there's really two differences that are happening here. First of all, that color of skin doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel quite right. There's too much imposed saturation that's not innate of the original scene. And because of the type of saturation that it feels very flat, like it's flattening out the dimension and the depth on her face. Here, even though this is not a super high ratio lighting setup, I can feel dimension and depth and variation as the light travels across her face as it hits from key side and wraps to fill side, right? Whereas over here in plugin A, it's just kind of getting washed in one color. Even like the discrimination between lips and cheeks starts to feel a little bit diminished as well. Okay, so there's these small differences that feel like, oh, that one's just a little bit more colorful and that one's a little bit less colorful, or it's a different kind of saturation. But these end up leading to like the defining aspects of the image that you're grading. And they end up defining what you have to do when you are grading. Because if you've got really good eyes, you might not notice this at all. But if you've got good eyes, you probably would notice like, all right, we could do better than this with our skin. We could do better by our talent than just letting this pass through and just doing basic balance underneath. But then you got to spend time and do that, as opposed to just having it right off the truck when we apply our Hollywood film plugin. Let's look at another popular plugin. I again asked it for the exact same recipe, 5207, 2383, Rec 709. Let's see what we get out of this plugin. So we're going to go from our Hollywood film to what I'll just call plugin B. This one's even more far-flung from our Hollywood film plugin. Like we've got this very, very thick, crunchy, kind of plugged up contrast happening down in the bottom. And what's interesting is typically when you add contrast, you will be seeing an increase in color as well. It's actually not what's happening here. Our color is being basically maintained. It's peeling more yellow if we look at our vector scope, but it's basically being maintained. So we've got this really off-center rendering here that if I could work with this at all, this is like a great example of this idea that the endpoint, if this was my baseline rendering of image, my endpoint would probably look a lot like the starting point of one of these big colorists working on a big movie. It's like I would be pumped to get to this from that. Does that make sense? But if I was already here, I could be climbing above that with the very first node, the very first adjustment that I made. And let's look at plugin B on this next shot as well. So again, we're on our Hollywood film rendering. Again, just take a second to enjoy the balanced and really great feeling baseline image that we have here with our Hollywood film plugin. Everything feels in bounds. It feels colorful, but it doesn't feel garish. It doesn't feel clipped. Nothing feels like it's challenging the edges of the display. It's all being gracefully fitted into the capability of the display. And if we apply the same plugin B that we looked at in the previous shot, the same trend is emerging. Like we've got these very, very crunchy plugged up blacks. We've got these like very like heavy colors and sort of like low saturation colors for what I would expect to see given that level of saturation. So again, like if this is my baseline, my my effort is going to be trying to get this somewhere near close to this. And at that point, my color grade will probably be more or less done. There might be a little bit of time left, there might not be, but if I'm already starting here, then I get to start with a very different starting point, and I get to seek things out, and I get to achieve a very different final outcome for my image and for the people I'm working with. Okay, last thing I want to talk about is something that we're going to see if we go to our Hollywood Film plugin and we look at shot number 4 here. So we've got one other plugin that I do want to take a look at, but before we do, I again just want to take a second, like you can decide for yourself how this has felt throughout our conversation today. But for me, every single time I go from one of these other options back to our Hollywood Film plugin, it just feels like I'm returning home. Feels like I'm back to center. It feels like I'm back into some kind of sweet spot. I can almost feel it in my body, like we've snapped into position there. And it's maybe the easiest to see in this image of any of the images that we've looked at because we've got such a neutral canvas. This is just a test image. It's just a nicely exposed, well-balanced, well-lit image without a lot of fanciness happening within it. And if we go from our Hollywood Film plugin to now plugin C, let's see what we've got here. So that tonality, that ratio that I just talked about feeling really well slotted and great, that's going away. We've bumped off of that. We've missed it here. So if I go from Hollywood Film to plugin C, we've just lost that sweet spot that we were in a moment ago. We're a little bit hotter with our exposure. And if we look at the actual color of my subject's skin, that's moved as well. Like take a look at our vector scope for a second. Let's take a look at our Hollywood Film rendering. So look at these two vectors here, which represent probably her skin is somewhere in here. And we're probably looking at like the yellow of the yellow stripes in her shirt and then like the orange. Okay. And then the red is somewhere over here pointing more straight towards red. But if we look at our yellow and our red, which by the way is like where skin lives in between yellow and red. And if we look at these, we can see that this plugin is rendering those things kind of right surrounding my skin tone line. It's gathering those things around my skin tone line. And if we bounce over here to plugin C, we're getting something different. We're getting our yellow being pulled towards, right? Like both of these are now missing to the left of the skin tone line and they're pulling toward yellow. Almost visually to me, it feels like it's pulling toward green, right? So Hollywood Film and then plugin C. So even though this is actually one of the more subtle differences that we've looked at, like it's not anywhere near as extreme as like going from our Hollywood Film to like plugin B, which especially if you look at it on a more neutral starting image, it's like, wow, that just feels very, very stark, very, very different and really challenging to contemplate as a starting point. The difference isn't that extreme. If we go from Hollywood Film back to plugin C, it's a smaller nudge, but it's moving me off center. It's adjusting my tonality, the overall shape of my contrast as I climb from shadows up to the middle and then reach toward the top and roll over. And it's moving the bias, the balance of my image, especially in this critical memory color of skin, the most critical memory color. And it's just biasing me into this kind of like yellowy, slightly greeny world that again, at some point I will either have to deal with or I may not notice depending on the amount of time I have in my grade. And once again, this points to the idea of starting at a point that is often the end point for us, the big Hollywood colors that is starting at a point that is more like our end point or our best efforts before we have to be done because we're out of time, we're out of money, whatever the case may be, okay? And the last thing I want to point out here, like I've emphasized several times in this conversation, the importance of understanding that the differences we are seeing are not just surface aesthetic differences in, oh, how I graded this shot versus how someone else might have graded this shot. These are differences in behavior, differences in system, differences in architecture. I want to talk about what those differences really are for just a second. So these three plugins that we've looked at here, these are three of the most popular film emulation plugins that are out there today, and they all represent some form of what I would call a surface or maybe a top-down form of film emulation. Now, what I mean when I say that is that these are emulations that are starting with a visual reference, meaning an image shot on film or a body of images shot on film, and they're basically saying, I'm going to use that reference. I'm going to use some set of tools, could be color correction tools, could be a different set of tools, but I'm going to use some set of tools to try and achieve a visual match onto my data set, onto my imagery. It's a surface or a top-down approach that begins and ends with the image itself, okay? What's happening here in this Hollywood film plugin is fundamentally different. What's giving rise to that different behavior that we're talking about is this difference in architecture, which is not surface or top down, it is bottom up. So it is starting with, how can I model the chemistry of the film system which I wish to emulate? It's really not emulation at all. It's more like modeling. And you start at the very bottom. You start with, what is the chemistry of this negative? What is the chemistry of the development process? What is the chemistry of the other steps that are happening in the laboratory? What is the chemistry of the print stock? What is the color of light, the printer points that are being pushed through that negative as the print stock is exposed? What is happening when we push our projector lamp through that printed film and onto a wall in a movie theater? All of these things are being considered and modeled and captured in a really high quality film model like the one that we're looking at here. And we're working our way from the bottom up, where actually the last step is the image. The image is there to tell us, did we do a good job? Did we build what we thought we were building? It is the end point, not the starting point, in a bottom up type of methodology. And that architecture is what leads to the fundamental differences that we're consistently seeing between these different renderings across all these images. Now, this can all seem a little bit discouraging, because we now know that we need this filmic rendering, this high quality filmic rendering, in order to achieve the grades that we aspire to, right? But if our tools are not giving us that high quality filmic rendering, where do we go? Well, I promised that I would tell you how I got this plugin a couple minutes ago. So in the last 6 years of my color science journey, I've ended up connecting with an Academy Award-winning film chemist named Dr. Mitch Bogdanowicz. Dr. Bogdanowicz, by the way, built the LUT for Joker, which is one of the movies that's high on our list that we started the conversation with here today. And cinematographer Steve Yedlin, ASC, who we've also already talked about today. And I ended up collaborating with these guys to take the same film modeling that they put into these movies and to put it into this plugin that we've been using here today. Very excited to announce we're going to be making this plugin available to everyone in 2 weeks, so that we all have access to this same elite level of photochemical look development. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Super excited to share more information about that. And if you are interested in going deeper in this type of Hollywood film pipeline, make sure you join me for grade school this Friday, where we're going to do a full 1-hour deep dive on this topic, and we're going to get a sneak peek at the plugin. In the meanwhile, go check out the videos that I've left a link to here in the description, and I will see you this Friday.